holiday, the United States commemorates the leader who embraced the unity of all faiths and on all people in love and truth. Though the U.S. takes pride that Dr. King was an American, this holiday also celebrates a global leader who inspired nonviolent liberation movements around the world.
Our guest speaker this morning is Michael Van Leesten. Mr. Van Leesten is a math teacher at Hopkins School who has served as the Director of Pathfinder Hopkins since 2007. Pathfinder is an academic skills development program designed to prepare New Haven public and parochial school students to enter and thrive in college prep schools like Westminster. Prior to becoming a teacher, Mr. Van Leesten was Vice President and CFO at Travelers Property Casualty Corporation. And before that, he spent over 7 years as an investment banker at Goldman Sachs & Co. Mr. Van Leesten graduated from Dartmouth College with degrees in English and economics and has an MBA from Columbia University.
Mr. Van Leesten's family connection to Dr. King comes from his father. His dad was an enlisted man of the Air Force based in France when he learned about Dr. King and the developing civil rights movement in the U.S. After leaving the service and returning to the U.S., Mr. Van Leesten's dad enrolled in college and subsequently participated in voter registration rights in Atlanta, Choctaw County of Alabama through the Southern Christian Leadership Conference led by Dr. King. Today, Mr. Van Leesten will share a few of his thoughts and experiences which capture how the Dr. King holiday is a day of celebration and appreciation of our common humanity, interracial cooperation, and intercultural sharing.
Hi, good morning. I hope there are a little technical difficulties with this. I hope you'll bear with me. First, I want to thank all of you for listening to this and for inviting me to talk to you. I don't consider myself a luminary of any kind. I'm a guy from Providence, Rhode Island, who have a wonderful family. I wanted to start by giving you a little more context, because context is extremely important when someone tells a story. And then what I'm going to do is just share with you some of the things that I've learned over the past 50 years that have helped guide me to where I am today, standing before you. I hope that some of it, maybe all of it, maybe one thing resonates with you, maybe nothing will, but I'm hoping for the best for each and every one of you. So a couple other points in my background. My great-grandmother and her sister were the first two African-American women to graduate from Brown University. Ethel, the older sister, my great-great-aunt, eventually taught at Howard University, was one of the founders of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, and then ultimately married a Cuban diplomat, lived in France for a while, then moved on to Cuba, and we never really heard from the family again. Only recently we found our ancestors and our relatives in Cuba. Cora went to Tuskegee Institute after graduating, taught there for a while, met my great-grandfather, who was a Jewish man from Suriname. They ultimately did not live together. She moved back to Providence. Ultimately, she did not have the kind of opportunities that I have been so fortunate to have, and she died in a mental institution in Tewksbury, Massachusetts in 1956. The other person who's been or ancestor who's been very important in sort of my narrative was my great-great-grandfather Nathaniel, who was born in 1818 in the Smoky Mountains in North Carolina. Nathaniel was half Cherokee, half African, not quite sure of his exact lineage. During the Trail of Tears, which some of you may be familiar with, the Cherokee and the Choctaw and a number of other tribes were driven off the land because gold was discovered in Appalachia. As they drove the Native Americans to Oklahoma, they went in and tried to take all of the half-breeds, as they called themselves, as slaves. And my grandfather, who was a very strong, physically strong guy and a very temperamental guy, kind of mean actually, fought quite viciously and refused to be a slave. Ultimately, he was not a slave. He was a driver or overseer and a sharecropper. And so through their stories, I've come to understand that whatever befalls me in this life, that better people have suffered far, far worse. And through my deeds, I've striven to give meaning to my life, but also give meaning to their lives. And I think that's the first lesson that I've learned, is that you can give meaning to your life and to the lives of others and the struggles of others. The other thing I think is important to start out with is that we are in a house that is consecrated to God, and in spite of the fact that we live in a highly secular part of the country, it's important to remember how much Martin Luther King's faith drove his conviction and determination, and ultimately his martyrdom. The moral arc of the universe is indeed long, but it does bend towards justice. So, with that, I would say, although I will try to give you some of the wisdom I've learned over the years, understand that this is just one person's story, and this is not a narrative of an entire people. And this was presented quite eloquently in a TED Talk by Chidamanda Adichie, who wrote the book Americana, among other things. She's a Nigerian author. And the title of the TED Talk was The Danger of a Single Story. And what I've been very careful to do is avoid the patronizing, well-meaning pity generated by the single story of a people or a place. And likewise, I've tried to avoid the contempt and sort of malignant characterization of people or a place based on a single narrative. And what she did, she concluded that these kinds of reactions rob people, both the receiver of the story and the subjects of the story, it robs them of their dignity and doesn't allow us to recognize our commonalities, our human connection. And so she said, quote, "When you recognize that there is not a single story about a place, you regain a part of heaven." To which I would follow with, when you recognize that there's not a single story of a people, you regain a part of your humanity. Another thing that made a big impression on me as I decided to become a teacher was I read a Brazilian philosopher's book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. And the thing that stood out to me was his assertion that pity is morally corrosive. It's malignant to both the pity and the pitier, because it separates them and creates an inability for them to recognize each other as equals. So, that said, I have great compassion, but I have no pity. I have no pity. I do not pity human beings. I have great compassion and empathy for them. And lastly, I've also learned there's a Muslim sheikh, a Sufi sheikh, very influential from the 11th century, Imam al-Ghazali, who wrote, "A person will always interpret everything he hears according to the light which dominates his heart." So be aware, as I try to be, of the light that dominates my heart, that dominates your heart. Okay, because at the end of the day, this conversation, this talk, this lecture, I'm not a fan of lecture, I don't do it in my classes. This is about your heart. This is about your heart, not your mind. I teach at a school, and you attend a school where it's all supremely intellectual. But that's not how you change people's minds. So I consult my heart as often, and I work to ensure that I project onto others what is good inside of me. So the first thing that, the earliest sort of awareness that I had that something was a little screwy with society was, I was a nerd. I am a nerd, a blurb actually. And I used to read the encyclopedia when I was young. That's how much of a nerd I was. I was 9 years old, I was in 4th grade, and we had the Encyclopedia Britannica. And I got to India, got to the I, reading about India, and I read about the caste system. I read about the Dalit. I don't remember much about, this is what I remember about this, and they are the untouchables. And I thought this was horrible, that you're born and you're stuck. You're stuck basically cleaning latrines for the rest of your life. It didn't matter how intelligent you were, it didn't matter anything. And I thought, oh my God, that's so horrible that they have a caste system here. Thank God here in the US we do. We do. And that's when it dawned on me that we have a caste system. And furthermore, as I continued to read the encyclopedia, I found that every society has this. Like, where does this come from? And there are, you know, I'll leave it to you to research on all the different reasons why academics and thinkers believe we have caste systems. But what I found was that in many cases, the discrimination involved was deemed to be sacred, part of the natural order, or part of some inviolable tradition that we couldn't possibly violate, or the world would come crashing down. So that kind of sat in my mind for the next 41 years. The next thing I've learned through my relationships with people is that contempt is the worst thing. It is incredibly corrosive because it cuts off connection. So whether it's a loved one, or whether it's your political opponent, or whether it's your teacher or your student, treating someone with contempt is the ultimate disconnection between people. And what I do, what I hope you might try to do, is to actively listen to others, especially those who have different views than you. You may not agree with everything they say, but what I do is I concentrate on what they're saying, and I'm not so ready to be prepared with a glib response. Sometimes there's a time for debate, and sometimes there's a time for listening and reflection, even with people with whom you don't agree. This helps you develop, certainly helped me develop patience and compassion towards people. It's helped me refine my own thinking about matters. And it also requires a fair degree of bravery and conviction because it's difficult to hear something you disagree with. I would ask you, when you have a chance, how many of you are familiar with Sarah Silverman, the comedian? Sarah Silverman. I was never a big fan of hers. She's a little too raw for me. But recently she did something wonderful. In that she went and visited Trump country. This is in Trump country here. She went and visited people, and sure enough, she found out, she was a show on Hulu. She found out, oh my God, these people are human beings. Oh my God, they have priorities, and they have understandings, and they have foibles, just like everybody else. But what's more important is that opening up her heart led her to have an entirely wonderful interaction with an internet troll on Twitter. I'll just leave it at that. I would ask you, look up Sarah Silverman and find out what opening your heart can actually do for not only yourself, but also for other people. The next thing was, that I wanted to point out was that I've had students at Hopkins ask me, my God, look at the enormity of the problems in the world. Look at the racism, the wars, the this and the that. And what can we possibly do? I'm 14 years old. What could I possibly do? And I'm a math teacher, so there's not a lot of room in my class for talking about social issues or whatever. I teach geometry. I don't know what can be political about that. But what I've told them and what I will tell you is that as an individual, I don't really have the capacity to change the whole world. But I have learned that on any given day, I have the capacity to change someone's whole world. Okay, so it's no one big thing. There's a word in Arabic called al-ma'lum. It means small kindnesses. So when you smile at someone, when you acknowledge them, when you see them, just in passing, instead of ignoring them. That's a big thing here in New England that I've noticed. People just walk right by each other, head down, about their business. Hugging someone, giving a small word of encouragement. No good deed is too small. No good deed is too small. And don't watch the news much because they don't really care about these small things that make life worth living. So then this leads me to something that is a Christian concept, or a developed Christian concept called agape. It's a form of love, goodwill, benevolence, and willful delight in the success of others. It's not sexual love, it's not romantic love, you're not swooning, it's not brotherly love or familiar love, it's utter compassion. It's a hard thing to attain, but worthy of effort. It requires intention, because your ego, my ego, is in a defensive crouch, always trying to protect me. Maybe you're trying to protect yourself from bullies. Maybe you're trying to protect yourself from being thought less of because you didn't get this grade in class, or you might disappoint your parents, or there are a million reasons. So it's hard. But as Confucius once wrote, it is easy to hate, and it is difficult to love. This is how the whole scheme of things works. All good things are difficult to achieve, and the bad things are very easy to get. And so as we sit in this church, consecrated to God and Christ, there's a passage from the Bible that is often read at weddings and is often misunderstood as an aspect of romantic love. But in fact, it is the perfect description of agape. And so for those of you who have attended a wedding, you may be familiar with this, but I'm going to read it because there's a particular point in verse 8 that is extremely important. So it's Corinthians 13, verses 4 through 8. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. And it keeps no records of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. And where there is knowledge, it will pass away. And so the last, one of the last influences on me in that vein is from a Moroccan Sufi saint who lived in the latter half of the 18th century and early 19th century, who wrote volumes of letters. His name was Darqawi. And he said something that I heard on a tape, on a CD once, that really has influenced me. It influenced me to become a teacher, actually. Because I walked away from a very lucrative career that everyone calls successful. The best thing you can do in this life is trust in God and give Him the benefit of the doubt. And the second best thing you can do in this life is trust in people and give them the benefit of the doubt. So in conclusion, I would ask each and every one of you, and I would ask myself, to consult your heart, acknowledge your heart, engage in small kindnesses, listen actively, give people the benefit of the doubt, and love each other simply for the sake of doing so. Thank you very much.